Most people read the Bible as a sequence of moral stories, lessons about faith, obedience, kings, and nations. But buried inside the earliest sections of the text is something far more unsettling. A recurring pattern of figures described as giants. Not once, not twice, but across multiple eras, regions, and generations. They appear in Genesis. They appear in Canaan. They appear in Bashan. And they appear again in the story of David and Goliath. Different names are used: Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, and later, Philistine warriors described as unusually large and powerful. And while interpretations vary widely, ranging from literal historical readings to symbolic explanations, the text itself is consistent in one thing. These figures represent something that ordinary people could not easily confront. And every time they appear in the narrative, the psychological tone of the world changes. Fear increases, armies hesitate, spies collapse under pressure, and entire nations begin redefining what they believe they are capable of facing. This is not just a story about physical conflict. It is a story about perception, about how humans respond when something feels larger than their ability to understand or control it. And that is why this period in biblical tradition is often referred to, informally, as the Age of Giants. Because whether literal or symbolic, the effect is the same. Humanity is repeatedly confronted with something it interprets as overwhelming. And what follows is a chain of psychological, social, and military reactions that shape entire generations. It begins in the earliest layers of the Genesis narrative, where a brief and cryptic passage describes a time when the sons of God saw the daughters of men and produced offspring known as the Nephilim. The text does not give detailed biological explanations. It does not linger on physical description. Instead, it emphasizes outcome. These beings are described as mighty men of renown. Whether one interprets this passage literally or metaphorically, what matters for the structure of the narrative is the connection it implies. That this era represents a disruption in normal human order, a boundary-crossing moment where stability begins to deteriorate. After the flood narrative, most readers assume the concept of giants disappears, but it does not. It reappears generations later, during the Israelite approach to Canaan. This is where the psychological dimension of the giant motif becomes even clearer. When Moses sends 12 spies to scout the land, they return with mixed reports. The land is fertile, rich, strategically valuable, but it is also inhabited. And among the inhabitants are figures described as descendants of Anak, the Anakim. And it is here that the narrative shifts from observation to psychological breakdown. Because the spies do not simply report military strength. They report self-perception. They say, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This is not a tactical disadvantage. It is a collapse in cognitive framing. The enemies are not just physically intimidating. They distort self-image. They alter how the observers perceive themselves in comparison. And that single shift becomes enough to destabilize an entire population. Because once fear becomes internalized at that level, it stops being a reaction. It becomes identity. The result is that an entire generation of Israelites is delayed from entering the land, not because they lacked weapons, but because they lacked psychological readiness. And this introduces one of the central themes of the entire giant narrative. The greatest power these figures represent is not physical strength. It is perceived disproportion, the sense that something is too large to overcome, too established to challenge, too overwhelming to resist. And that perception alone becomes enough to shape national decisions. From here, the narrative moves forward into another region east of the Jordan River, the Kingdom of Bashan, a fortified territory associated with strong cities and older traditions in the biblical text. Here, we are introduced to King Og of Bashan, described as the last of the Rephaim, a group associated with earlier giant traditions. The text emphasizes his scale indirectly through details such as the size of his bed or resting place, which is described as unusually large. This detail is not presented casually. It functions as a signal, a way of reinforcing perceived abnormality. And more importantly, Og represents continuity. He is portrayed as a surviving remnant of something ancient, something that predates the current order. When the Israelites confront him, the narrative emphasizes total victory, not just defeat, but removal. Because in the structure of the story, Og is not just a military enemy. He represents the last visible trace of an older world system. And his defeat signals a transition. The Age of Giants, as a dominant force in the narrative, is beginning to close. But it does not disappear yet. It reappears one final time in its most famous form, Goliath. By the time of David and Goliath, the giant motif has changed. It is no longer widespread. It is concentrated, rare, almost symbolic in its presentation. Goliath appears as a Philistine warrior of extraordinary size and strength, equipped with heavy armor and advanced weaponry for his time. But what makes this story psychologically significant is not just his physical description. It is the reaction he produces. For 40 days, the Israelite army refuses to engage him, not because they lack numbers, but because they lack psychological certainty. He does not measure himself against Goliath in physical terms. Instead, he reframes the situation entirely, and that reframing breaks the psychological structure that had immobilized everyone else. What the army perceived as an overwhelming threat, David perceives as an addressable challenge. And that shift in perception becomes the turning point of the entire story. Because once perception changes, action becomes possible. And once action becomes possible, the giant loses his psychological advantage. This is the deeper function of the Goliath narrative. It is not just about victory. It is about breaking imposed scale distortion. And this connects back to every earlier appearance of giants in the text. Because whether Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, or Goliath, the consistent pattern is not just size. It is psychological impact. In every case, these figures are associated with overwhelming presence. They are described in ways that elevate perception of difficulty. And the response from human groups is almost always the same: hesitation, fear, or complete withdrawal from confrontation. Which raises a deeper interpretive question that scholars and theologians have debated for centuries. Are these giants meant to be understood strictly as literal beings? Or are they narrative representations of overwhelming systems, powers, and fears that ancient societies struggled to conceptualize? The text does not force a single interpretation. Instead, it preserves the effect, and the effect is consistent across all accounts. Whenever these figures appear, human perception of capability is challenged. And once perception is challenged, behavior changes. Armies retreat, spies panic, leadership decisions shift, and entire populations adjust their understanding of what is possible. This is why the Age of Giants is not just a sequence of isolated stories. It is a recurring psychological structure embedded within the narrative. Nephilim represent the earliest disruption of boundaries and order. Anakim represent fear during territorial expansion. Og represents the remnants of older fortified powers. And Goliath represents concentrated intimidation at the threshold of Israel's transition into monarchy. Each stage reflects a different phase of the same underlying theme: human confrontation with perceived disproportionate power. And over time, the narrative gradually shifts. Giants become less central, not because fear disappears, but because the identity of the nation changes. The focus moves from external survival to internal governance. From existential threat to structured society. From mythic confrontation to institutional stability. And as that shift occurs, giants fade from prominence in the text. But they do not disappear from memory. They remain embedded as a symbolic reminder of a time when human perception itself was constantly tested. When courage was not just physical, but cognitive. Because the real battle in every giant narrative is not fought at the moment of contact. It is fought the moment perception is formed, before any sword is lifted, before any army moves, before any decision is made. And that is what makes this entire Age of Giants narrative so enduring. Because regardless of interpretation, it reflects a universal human experience. The tendency to overestimate threat when something feels larger than our frame of reference. And the equally powerful possibility that once perception shifts, even the most overwhelming figures lose their psychological dominance. Which is why, across all these stories, one pattern ultimately repeats itself more clearly than any other. The giants do not fall because they change. They fall because perception changes. And once that happens, what once looked impossible becomes simply another challenge in front of you.